In June 1942, an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the most brutal and significant battles of the entire Second World War. At Midway, the American and Japanese fronts clashed, staining the oceanic waters with blood and molten metal. After 3 days, nearly 3,500 people had perished in one of the most astonishing humiliations suffered by the Japanese Empire. In this installment of military history, we invite you to enter that hell wearing the uniform of the Japanese Navy, to understand how that battle unfolded from their perspective. Sunken aircraft carriers, downed ships, and thousands of lives extinguished. How was it possible? Today, we will find out. Before the Second World War, the Empire of Japan presented itself to the world as an invincible power. Japanese troops had defeated on several occasions the countries that would form the Allied bloc, thus demonstrating their tactical and material superiority. These victories allowed the small island to conquer Hong Kong, Shanghai, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and countless nearby territories. All this expansionist zeal was summarized in a concept created and promoted by imperial authorities, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Essentially, it represented the dream of creating a bloc similar to the Soviet Union, but with Asian nations that would be led by Japan to finally liberate themselves from European influence. From the Japanese island, they felt that their military superiority also translated into racial superiority. They believed that portion of the planet belonged to Japan by right, echoing the idea of Nazi living space. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Admiralty carried out an operation that changed history. That morning, Pearl Harbor was attacked by a number of bombers never before seen, turning the American base into a floating inferno. The images captured during that day circled the globe, and as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt described it, that would be a date which will live in infamy.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes. These pictures were made by a fearless cameraman who thought nothing of his personal safety to make possible this record for all posterity. A single lucky hit was responsible for the disaster that befell the Arizona when a Jap bomb falling directly through one of the battleship's funnels exploded in the engine room and set ablaze tons of fuel oil.
The Japanese attack was intended as a preemptive action to prevent the intervention of the United States Pacific Fleet in the military actions planned by the Empire of Japan in Southeast Asia. However, the attack that dragged the United States into World War II was only partially successful. The large American aircraft carriers were not anchored in port as the Japanese had hoped, so their effort failed to destroy Uncle Sam's maritime projection capability. From one of those legendary aircraft carriers, the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off on April 18, 1942, and bombed the city of Tokyo, causing panic among the population. In May of the same year, the Americans used their carriers to thwart Japanese movements towards Australia during the Battle of the Coral Sea. The powerful American response convinced Japanese high command that they needed to strike at enemy aircraft carriers if they wanted to continue dreaming of total conquest of Southeast Asia. Let's hear the words of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo.
帝国の流体、東亜の荒廃、まさにこの一戦にある。一億国民が一切を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。発行を家となす公募のもとに、この人中報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。
According to information provided by Japanese intelligence, the American aircraft carriers were sailing in waters near Midway Islands, an atoll located in the North Pacific, near the northwestern end of the Hawaiian archipelago. The name Midway refers to its geographical position. being halfway between America and Asia. With this in mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto proposed a risky theory. He believed that remaining on the defensive against a power with the industrial might and human resources of the United States would be suicidal. Therefore, he devised an offensive plan to be executed at this strategically valuable atoll. The concept was to cause such an impact that it would force the enemy to negotiate for peace, allowing Japan to retain the conquered lands. In mid-April 1942, the Japanese decided that their best option was to lure the American aircraft carriers to sink them all, and then take Midway with the aim of expanding their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. This operation was seen as preparation for invading Fiji and Samoa, as well as potentially advancing towards Hawaii. The occupation of the atoll, similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor, was not part of a campaign to conquer America, but rather aimed at eliminating the strategic power of the Americans in the Pacific Ocean. This would allow the Japanese a clear path to establish a significant sphere of political and economic influence in the region. Like all Japanese plans during World War II, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was complex and based on certain assumptions. Firstly, from the Japanese perspective, the only available aircraft carriers to defend Midway were the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. The USS Lexington had been sunk, and they believed the USS Yorktown had suffered serious structural damage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. However, after quick repairs at Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown was back in action, unbeknownst to the Japanese. Even more significant was what the Japanese assumed about American morale. Japanese high command was convinced that their rival was demoralized and unmotivated due to their frequent defeats in the preceding 6 months. Yamamoto felt that frustration could be crucial in luring the Americans into a trap, driven by a desire for revenge at any cost, thus definitively compromising their naval and air power in the Pacific Ocean. To achieve this, Yamamoto planned to disperse his forces so they could not be discovered before the battle, and then converge on the enemy with surprise and concentrated force once the confrontation began. As we mentioned earlier, it was a complex plan, but if successful, it would be a death sentence for the United States. The reality was that the Japanese were very confident, perhaps overly so to the point of overlooking some fundamental issues. For instance, capturing Midway required an unprecedented amphibious assault operation. Up to that point, the Japanese Navy had only conducted such attacks in undefended or lightly defended areas. The atoll was a small territory, so it was certain that there would be American presence across the entirety of Midway, further complicating the landing. And that wasn't the only obstacle. There were also natural challenges standing between Japan and its imperial dreams. The atoll is surrounded by vast coral reefs, which are a deadly trap for any unprepared amphibious vessel. Even at high tide, the water depth was barely enough for Asian boats to cross the reef without suffering structural damage. This meant that the invasion would largely have to be conducted by air, placing excessive importance on the imperial aircraft carriers. The success or utter failure of the mission depended entirely on the performance of these ships, which proved to be a fatal decision. Let's return to the final days of April 1942, when the Japanese Admiralty was preparing its strategy.
The problem with the Japanese was that they had scattered their fleet over a very wide area. It was organised into component parts, none of which could support each other. So, in effect, as a total number, the Japanese outnumbered the Americans, but when it came to a face-to-face battle, they didn't.
In order to deceive the enemy, Yamamoto dispersed his ships so that all remained hidden before the battle. His group of battleships and supporting cruisers followed Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's aircraft carriers several hundred kilometers away. Their mission was to approach and destroy any elements that could defend Midway after being weakened by attacks from the aircraft carriers. What the Admiral did not know was that this tactic would prevent him from properly defending his positions, ultimately giving the advantage to the enemy. Even worse, Something he could not have known was that American spies had managed to decipher the Japanese naval code and were able to translate several of their secret messages. But remember, today we will focus on the Japanese perspective of this legendary battle. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary maneuver, and the next day the Battle of Midway began. The Japanese fleet then headed towards Midway, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 433 combat aircraft. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 360 combat aircraft. These numbers serve to illustrate the magnitude of this confrontation in the far reaches of the Pacific. This is how Imperial pilot Harada Kaname remembered his experience before taking off.
ところがね、もう飛行機に乗ってみたらもうそこで海がすぐ近くで、果たしてこれは罹患できるかなというふうに思ったんですけども、もうそんなこと言ってる場合じゃないもんで、整備員にもしっかり捕まえてもらっていて、オーバーブーストまでやって、それで、走らせたらすぐもう脚を引っ込めの、操作をやりました。どうやら船から離れてザーッと進んでいって、これは落ちるかなと思ったら、それでもそこで浮力がついてどうやら上がりましたね。
The next day, in the early morning of June 4th, Japanese Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched a wave of 108 aircraft against Midway. At the same time, he deployed reconnaissance aircraft to locate the enemy fleet. Japanese Zero fighters managed to shoot down 17 American units that came out to confront them. Not a single Japanese aircraft was shot down. From that moment on, the Japanese bombed and strafed the atoll, destroying gasoline depots, seaplane hangars, observation towers, vehicles, and anti-aircraft artillery. Around 6:30 in the morning, Japanese aircraft carriers severely damaged the American base with a second wave of bombers. In the skies, aircraft from both sides fought fiercely, resulting in a large number of shootdowns and explosions. As minutes passed, Uncle Sam's pilots began to gain the upper hand and forced the withdrawal of large Japanese air units.
Japanese planes were shot down by the score. One flew slap into this.
Of the 108 Japanese aircraft used in this initial advance on Midway, 11 were destroyed, 14 suffered severe damage, and another 29 required repairs. With these figures, and considering that American bombers could still use parts of the base to refuel and return to attack, the first wave was considered a failure. It was crucial to intensify hostilities if they intended to establish a foothold for a large-scale landing in the following days. The Japanese officer in charge of the operation, Joichi Tomonaga, communicated to Admiral Nagumo that it was necessary to launch a second raid to complete the destruction of the base. In the first attack on Midway, he had opted to equip reserve aircraft with torpedoes, fearing they might encounter American ships. Therefore, conducting a second offensive was essential, as the atoll's airstrip had not been destroyed due to the lack of ground bombs. All aircraft in the second wave, including reserve planes, were ordered to be armed with bombs to destroy the island's facilities, an order that proved fatal. The major problem was that replacing torpedoes would take a long time, at least half an hour per aircraft. In the midst of this process, a lagging Japanese cruiser delivered Nagumo the worst possible news. 10 enemy ships were heading towards Midway. Consumed by panic, Nagumo ordered all aircraft to be brought back up to the deck and the bombs to be exchanged for torpedoes, further wasting time in a battle where the clock was the main antagonist. It was then that some American ships detected the Japanese aircraft carriers at their most vulnerable moment, when the deck was filled with planes loaded with torpedoes. If these were destroyed, the resulting explosions could be devastating and potentially sink them to the bottom of the Pacific. And so it happened. The explosion of Japanese aircraft armed with torpedoes also ignited the fuel depots, causing the 3 hit aircraft carriers to sink. It was a devastating blow for the Japanese. Once again, let's hear the words of Harada Kanami.
だから我々は見たところが下張ってくるんですよ、雷撃隊ね。これを盛んに攻撃やってたんですよね。そしたら上ドントリスが来てるわけです。それを知らないんですよね。だから向こうの魚雷は一発も当たってないはずです。ところがその時に上にドントリスが来てて、このドントリスにうまく命中させられてしまって、ああいう大悲劇を受けたわけですよね。
Imagine you are a Japanese sailor who has been educated for years in the Japanese doctrine of military and racial superiority. Before departing for Midway, your superiors described to you a master plan designed to send the enemy's main ships to the bottom of the ocean, one of the great Western powers. Everything is on your side: geography, surprise, and the number of ships. The problem is that when the moment of combat arrives, in the blink of an eye, hundreds of your comrades are killed. Thousands more are stranded. Your nation's maritime strength burns in flames on the waves of the Pacific. It is truly difficult to comprehend the shock felt by the Japanese troops in the face of such a crushing and unexpected defeat. Admiral Nagumo had to make difficult decisions during the days of the Battle of Midway. According to Japanese naval doctrine, large-scale and organized aerial attacks were favored over deploying small numbers of aircraft to defend or attack specific points. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy with the quantity and intensity of the attack. However, to achieve this, accurate information about the enemy's positions and movements was crucial. Otherwise, you would be sending a powerful fleet to its demise. Lacking such information, Nagumo chose the doctrinal approach and held back a reserve of aircraft on the carriers until he could organize a large-scale launch. Many argue that if he had deployed the available force, they could have potentially sunk some of Washington's carriers. Of course, these are just speculations. History has already been written, and this particular one had a clear victor. The Hiryu, the only intact Japanese aircraft carrier, launched its planes against the USS Yorktown, causing serious damage. However, shortly after, the Hiryu was attacked by bombers from the Enterprise, leaving it severely damaged and sinking the next day. Upon being informed of the loss of all 4 carriers, Admiral Yamamoto gave the order to withdraw. On June 6th, during that retreat, American aircraft bombed the cruiser Mikuma, which sank with 650 sailors on board. The campaign that had presumed Japan's victory ended in one of its worst humiliations.
Now putting to sea with a U.S. Navy cameraman, we see a new chapter just released of the great American naval victory at Midway, the attack on the carrier Yorktown. Filmed under fire, the battle that cost the Japs 10 warships, 4 carriers, and nearly 300 planes. Damaged by direct hits, the gallant Yorktown steams on. Her flight deck ablaze, the crew calmly fights the flames as gunners keep up their withering barrage of anti-aircraft fire.
The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including sailors and pilots. These pilots were the most skilled and experienced in the Japanese Air Force. There was no doubt. The United States not only won, but also demonstrated that it was stronger than ever and willing to fight to the end to avenge what happened at Pearl Harbor. The significance of the battle on that small atoll cannot be underestimated. It was a turning point in World War II, with many attributing Japan's defeat in the Pacific to this failure, a viewpoint supported by strong arguments. Losing 4 out of their 6 aircraft carriers left Japan unable to pursue further conquests in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. After Midway, Japan lost military initiative and adopted a defensive posture, which its admirals had diagnosed as a serious mistake. For the first time in the war, the number of Japanese and American ships was equalized, with the advantage that American industry could build new aircraft carriers more quickly. In fact, by 1945, Washington managed to launch 35 aircraft carriers, while the Japanese barely compensated for those lost at Midway.
America is building freighters by day and night. Red-hot rivets and red-hot rivet catchers are on the job. They're turning out the ships, and the ships are delivering the goods.
The production capacity was central to what happened in the rest of the War of the Pacific. The American industrial machine was gearing up in 1942, and its products really started to come out in mass numbers in 1943.
Analyzing Japan's defeat from the perspective of its admirals and soldiers, it's possible to identify a factor that condemned the empire throughout the conflict: overconfidence and limitless imperialistic vision. Every Japanese man was convinced that their nation could defeat any army on the planet. At the same time, there was blind faith in the complicated military strategies of their officers, which relied not only on the capability of their men, but also on luck. Relying on fate and fortune is not uncommon in wartime, but it should be the exception rather than the rule. Finally, the primary reason for Japan's failure was the lack of emphasis on intelligence work. Having a gigantic and well-prepared fleet is excellent, but it's useless if your soldiers operate with unconfirmed information and your messages are intercepted by the enemy. For all these reasons and more, the American victory at Midway remains a fascinating and pivotal chapter in World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a massive surprise air attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, dozens of American ships were ablaze, along with hundreds of their planes. Thus, the Empire of the Rising Sun began its ambitious and bloody campaign of conquest across the Pacific. This naval base was not Japan's only target. Almost simultaneously, all of the European colonies in Southeast Asia were besieged by brutal Japanese soldiers. The reason for this large-scale offensive was obvious. Only with a lightning attack could they seize all the resources necessary for final victory. If they failed, defeat would be the only fate that awaited them. Today, in this new episode of military history, we will tell you all about Japan's brutal initial campaigns during World War II and their terrible cost.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Cargo in place, Japan develops a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, it's trying to negotiate a diplomatic solution and sends a representative to Washington to try to find a way out. And the emperor is generally trying to find a peaceful solution. But the military is also planning for an attack.
Knowing the humiliation that diplomatic means would bring, the Japanese opted for the second option, taking up arms. Their plan was extremely ambitious. They were to simultaneously attack the main Pacific Ocean territories controlled by the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. Only in this way, by taking all these colonies at once, could they achieve victory, since they knew that in a prolonged war, they had a great chance of losing. But despite the risks of the operation, the Japanese were confident. They saw their rivals as weak and cowardly, especially the Americans. They believed that if they were able to destroy their Pacific fleet, which was concentrated around the base of Pearl Harbor, they would be forced to ask for peace. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was entrusted with this mission. Under his command were 10 battleships, 10 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of the latest aircraft.
Against him, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had 8 World War I vintage battleships and 2 carriers. Yamamoto planned the attack with great care. He would hit the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, since, according to intelligence reports, it usually spent the weekends in port.
This meant that the ships would be in port, where they would be easy prey for bombing. December 7th, 1941, was chosen as the fateful date for the offensive. To make the attack even more surprising, a Japanese delegation traveled to Washington a few days earlier to negotiate a possible Japanese withdrawal from Chinese territory. The Americans had no idea that one of the key moments of the entire Second World War would soon arrive. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave of aircraft took off from the aircraft carriers located just a few leagues from the base. Most of the soldiers and sailors stationed at Pearl Harbor were just beginning to wake up when the sirens began to sound. Just as Yamamoto had planned, they were taken completely by surprise.
Five US ships were hit immediately.
"21 ships were sunk, most of them unable to respond, and air bases were destroyed by bombs from Japanese planes. Within hours, the American naval port lay in ruins as fire devoured everything in its path. Before the defenders could mount a counteroffensive, the attackers retreated back into the open ocean, leaving behind only chaos and destruction.
It was all over in less than 2¼ hours. Yamamoto's plan had worked like a dream. Or had it?
The two American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor were not at the base at the time of the attack, so they were not damaged. Other ships that initially seemed to have been put out of action only suffered minor damage, and in just a couple of months could be back in the water. In addition, the opinion of the American public, which had been against the war, now turned completely in the opposite direction. Thousands took to the streets calling on then-President Franklin Roosevelt to join the Allies, and he did so the very next day. But as mentioned above, Pearl Harbor was not the only target of Yamamoto and his fleet. Almost simultaneously, the colonies of the European powers in Southeast Asia were invaded by Japanese soldiers, supported by their powerful air and naval forces.
It thought it had knocked out America. Now it moved against Britain and its colonies. The first to be hit was Malaya, where a Japanese force came ashore in the northeast of the country.
Malaya and Burma tried to resist the advance of the attackers, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the enemy. The Japanese's main mission was to conquer Singapore at the southern tip of Malaysia. This place served as one of the main British bases in the region, and whoever controlled it would have a great advantage over their opponents. The Europeans had turned Singapore into a fortress that they believed was impenetrable, but they made a grave mistake. They expected an attack by sea. The Japanese, however, had other plans. Even though approximately 30,000 Imperial soldiers were rapidly descending through the dense Malayan jungle, the British were calm. They saw the Japanese as disorganized and almost barbaric fighters. They maintained that the only reason for their victory at Pearl Harbor had been due to the element of surprise. But now that they knew they were coming, they would not stand a chance. Nevertheless, the enemy continued to advance. When they were close enough to the city, they began a brutal aerial bombardment of Singapore that destroyed much of its infrastructure. 2 British ships were moved towards the island to confront the attackers, but in less than 2 hours both had been destroyed, with thousands of sailors perishing in the waters of the Pacific. This defeat was the worst maritime disaster for the United Kingdom in the entire Second World War, but it would not be the last humiliation suffered on this battlefront. By January 11th, 1942, almost all of Malaysia had been conquered. The British defenders, approximately 100,000 men, were at the base in Singapore awaiting the enemy attack. As mentioned before, the defenses of the fort had been designed for a naval invasion. The huge 15-inch guns, for example, were aimed directly at the sea. So when the final Japanese offensive was carried out on land, they were of no use in stopping them.
The Japanese launched an assault in early February. was supported by more airstrikes. The British defence was soon reduced to chaos. Civilian casualties began to escalate.
For 4 days, the British tried to hold out as long as possible, seeking to inflict as many casualties on the enemy as possible. But reinforcements were never sent, and knowing that postponing the fighting would only mean more defenders dead, they eventually surrendered. More than 90,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war in what turned out to be the largest surrender of an English force in history. This defeat not only meant the loss of the important naval base at Singapore, but also marked the beginning of the collapse of the British Empire in Asia. Elsewhere on the continent, the Japanese continued to reap success after success. In the Philippines, an American colony, the Japanese had managed to eliminate American air bases through intense bombing. Without encountering any resistance, they were able to land on its shores in freedom. The defenders were quickly surrounded by the attackers and had to give up miles of territory. In just 10 days, Manila, their capital, had been captured. Uncle Sam's surviving soldiers were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, the last point of control in their hands. As with the British in Singapore, they sought to hold out as long as possible until their superiors sent reinforcements. And as their hopes were in vain. On April 3, 1942, a massive Japanese assault swept away the defenders, who had to surrender a week later. Before boarding the ship on which he was evacuated, General MacArthur, in charge of the American forces, declared, "I will return." With the fall of the Philippines, the only remaining Allied base in Asia was Burma. This English colony had held out a little longer than the others, but the final results were no different.
The British defences had been utterly neglected. There were only some 15,000 men defending the country. They were no match for the Japanese. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance.
Like the rest of the bases on this continent, the equipment of the garrison was simply inferior to that of the Japanese. The 15,000 British in charge of resisting could do little to contain the Japanese offensive. In May 1942, the last remaining defenders in the country were finally driven out by the attackers. In just 6 months, the Japanese Empire had taken over almost the entire Pacific Ocean. The bases of the European and North American powers were in their hands, and everything seemed to indicate that this would continue. Yamamoto's plan for a lightning attack had worked perfectly, or at least that's what they thought. The reality was that, despite their numerous victories, they had not been able to achieve one of their main objectives. As previously stated, the American aircraft carriers had not been affected by the attack on Pearl Harbor, so the fleet had not been destroyed as the Japanese had wished. Furthermore, Uncle Sam's high industrial capacity meant that within a few months, he was already in a position to return the blows he had received. Knowing that victory was not yet assured with the territories won, the Japanese leaders decided to expand their conquests. Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands would serve as bases from which they could threaten Australia, one of their greatest rivals in the area. So that was where they sought to attack on May 3, 1942. The islands fell quickly, but the Americans had an ace up their sleeve. They had been able to decipher Japanese communications, and so they knew when and where the offensive would be to take the rest of the objectives. When the Japanese fleet entered the Coral Sea, in preparation for the invasion of Papua New Guinea, the American ships were waiting for it. The naval battles lasted 2 days before the Japanese withdrew. In practical terms, the battle was a draw, since both sides lost an aircraft carrier. But it was actually a major tactical victory for the Allies, as Australia was now out of imminent danger. The Japanese, however, did not sit idly by. Their next target was the Midway Islands near Hawaii. From there, they would be able to launch another devastating attack on Pearl Harbor that would this time put the fleet out of action once and for all. But they were not yet aware that the Americans could listen in and read all their communications. Once the objective of the next attack was clear, they planned a naval ambush against the Imperial Navy. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942. It is considered by many to be the turning point of the entire theater of operations in the Pacific. Both sides decided to risk everything, moving most of their aircraft carriers into combat. Hundreds of ships and planes faced each other for 3 days in the blue waters around the islands. For a moment, it seemed that the Japanese, led by Admiral Nagumo, had gained the upper hand, as the antiquated American planes were unable to damage their ships. But while the Japanese fought off the fighters, American bombers, which had remained out of radar range, swooped down from high altitudes.
US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on these ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American air power. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink.
The destruction was total. All 4 Imperial aircraft carriers were reduced to ashes by bombs, and the loss of more than 300 aircraft and approximately 2,000 men was added. The United States, for its part, lost only 1 of these ships. After Midway, Japan was deprived of its naval power. For the duration of the war, it was never again able to threaten the Allies. It was now completely on the defensive, while the Americans prepared their massive counterattack.
Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pile. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing.
But the Japanese were still far from being defeated. In land battles, they had not yet known defeat. Seeing their plans for maritime conquest faded, they decided to strengthen their position on the mainland. That was why they once again focused on the region of Papua New Guinea, in addition to strengthening their bases in the Solomon Islands. As mentioned, from there they could threaten the cities of Australia by air. But unlike previous campaigns, they would now face serious difficulties. The defenders had learned to fight in the dense jungles of the Pacific, and Japanese supplies remained scarce. In addition, Allied naval superiority meant that reinforcements brought by sea frequently ended in disaster, with most of the soldiers drowned or captured. One of the most important Solomon Islands for the Japanese was Guadalcanal. There, the Imperials had built an airfield from which they could attack the maritime convoys that supplied the Americans. Knowing that the Americans were preparing to invade, the Imperials strengthened their defenses. This next battle would determine their final victory or defeat. The Allies landed on the island on August 7, 1942. At first, they met no resistance. The Japanese let them settle in peace for the first day, but if the Americans thought that meant they were ready to surrender, they were very much mistaken. During the night, a naval force destroyed the American ships on the coast. The few ships that remained had to flee. The Allies now found themselves completely isolated in the jungle. But the Japanese were not able to take advantage of their situation. They decided to retreat inland to strengthen their position, but this allowed the Allies to take the airfield for themselves. Thus, the Imperial soldiers were deprived of their airbase, from which they could stop the arrival of enemy reinforcements. The Japanese situation had become desperate.
It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath.
During these campaigns, the Japanese began to use the dreaded tactic of suicide attacks. Hundreds or thousands of Imperial soldiers would rush toward the Americans, firing their rifles or brandishing their swords. But the well-positioned defenders would often mow them down with their machine guns. Japanese officers did not resort to this strategy for the results, but rather as a way to safeguard their honor. They preferred death in combat to surrender or fall victim to the hunger or disease that often plagued these islands. The battles on Guadalcanal lasted for months, but the chances of imperial victory were never great. By early 1943, both sides were extremely exhausted. Neither had been able to bring fresh soldiers to the front. But in late January of that year, American ships were able to bring in reinforcements that replaced the exhausted combatants. With this new push, the Allies began another offensive. The Japanese, almost out of ammunition, medicine, and food, were unable to cope. Of the approximately 35,000 Japanese soldiers on the island in mid-1942, it is believed that only 1,000 survived.
By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed.
There were still dozens of islands in Japanese hands, as well as much of Southeast Asia, but it was only a matter of time before their fall. The objective of the Blitzkrieg to seize the precious resources necessary for the operation of their war machine had failed, and with it, the chances of victory. In Guadalcanal, almost 3 years before Japan's final surrender, their fate had been sealed. Night falls on an island in the Pacific Ocean. On one side, over 2,000 fierce soldiers from the Empire of Japan are given the order to capture Point Lunga and the Guadalcanal airfield. On the other side, 840 American soldiers are determined not to retreat even a single step, even if it means paying with their own lives. This was the starting point of the Battle of Edson Ridge, one of the most brutal stories of the Allied campaign in the Pacific. But how was it possible for a small battalion to annihilate thousands of well-trained and determined Japanese troops? In this new installment, we will find out by stepping into the boots of the soldiers who fought in Guadalcanal. During World War II, the Pacific Front was one of the main theaters of action for the U.S. forces. Many of their military operations were concentrated there, and one of the most impressive began in August 1942 with the Guadalcanal campaign, also known to the Allies as Operation Watchtower. It lasted until February 9, 1943, marking the first major offensive launched by the Allies against the forces of the Empire of Japan, the Asian ally of the Third Reich. On August 7th, thousands of troops launched a massive landing in a series of territories south of the Solomon Islands, with the aim of preventing them from being used as Japanese bases. From there, the Empire could attack the supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, cutting off any attempt at a powerful coalition. The Allies also sought to use Guadalcanal and Tulagi as a starting point from which they could support a campaign to capture or neutralize the main Japanese bases in Rabaul, New Britain. Being an ocean dotted with tiny territories, the Pacific presented great strategic complexities. Any conquered portion could mean military superiority.
After establishing an initial foothold within marine landings, the United States quickly found itself on the defensive. It would be the first time they faced off against a major Japanese army unit.
Initially, the Allied forces overwhelmed the Japanese troops, achieving a swift victory that allowed them to plant their flag in a region of great importance. To give you an idea of the significance of Guadalcanal, this small island even had an airfield under construction, which would allow for constant takeoffs near the Allies' supply route. This is why the Japanese were unwilling to relinquish the enclave. Since August 1942, they made several attempts to reclaim what was lost, resulting in a total of 3 land battles, 5 naval engagements, and daily aerial combat. Among the land battles, one was particularly marked by its violence and epic nature. The Battle of Edson Ridge, a fierce struggle for control of the Guadalcanal airfield. In response to the Allied landings, the Imperial General Headquarters of Japan assigned the 17th Army, a corps based on the island of Rabaul and commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake. Their task was to retake Guadalcanal from the Allied invaders. The problem was that Tokyo underestimated the situation, as they lacked accurate information about the actual number of Allied troops in the area, a grave error that worsened over the weeks. The 17th Army was heavily involved in the Japanese campaign in New Guinea, leaving few units available to send south to the Solomon Islands. Among the trained combat personnel were the 35th Infantry Brigade, under the command of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, stationed in Palau, the 4th Infantry Regiment, based in the Philippines, and the 28th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, embarked on transport ships near Guam. The different units began to move towards Guadalcanal immediately to concentrate all efforts into a single, powerful offensive. On September 7, 1942, Major General Kawaguchi decided it was time to, in his own words, lead and annihilate the enemy in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal airfield. His plan was to organize his troops into 3 divisions to approach the perimeter of Point Lunga, a coastal section to the north of the island, culminating in a surprise night attack that would destroy the Allied presence. One portion of the forces would advance towards the perimeter from the west, while a second army, known as the Kuma Battalion, would do so from the east. The main assault would come from Kawaguchi's central force, which had 3,000 soldiers divided into 3 battalions. By September 7th, most of the Japanese personnel were marching towards the coastal line of Point Lunga, with around 250 soldiers remaining at the base to guard the brigade's supply depot. On the other side, the Allies were aware that the attack was imminent and prepared for it.
Between August 21st and September 3rd, General Alexander Archer Vandergrift had made intense efforts to improve the defensive capabilities of the Lunga perimeter. He had relocated 3 Marine battalions from Tulagu and Gavutu to Guadalcanal.
And native scouts under the direction of Martin Clemens, an officer of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defense Force, sent reports about the Japanese presence. This way, the U.S. Marines learned of the Japanese soldiers stationed at Taivu. On September 8, 1942, the distinguished Brigadier General of the Marine Corps, Merritt Austin Edson, was put in charge of the situation. He planned a powerful offensive against the Japanese landings, which would allow them to defend all of Guadalcanal, even against a numerous and well-armed enemy. Edson's men, after being transported by boats to near the Taivu base, occupied Tasimboko, causing the Japanese defenders to retreat into the jungle. Moreover, at that location, the American troops discovered Kawaguchi's main supply depot, which contained large quantities of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and a powerful shortwave radio. After destroying everything in sight, except for documents and equipment that they took with them, the Marines returned to their initial perimeter. This was a severe blow to the Japanese strategy. Kawaguchi's men suddenly found their supplies depleted. But the most important thing was what the Americans learned from the raid. The amount of supplies, along with the intelligence gathered from the captured documents, indicated that at least 2,000 Imperial soldiers were on the island preparing for an attack. Edson, along with Colonel and Operations Officer Gerald Thomas, was correct in believing that the Japanese attack would come from a narrow, grass-covered coral ridge located 910 meters away and parallel to a river that bordered just south of the Guadalcanal airfield. This area, known as Point Lunga, provided a natural route to approach the facilities and had almost no defenders at that moment. It was the weakest link in the entire chain. To withstand the imminent assault, on September 11th, 840 men from Edson's battalion, positioned themselves around the ridge. They knew their mission was suicidal, as they had to defend the area against an enemy who nearly tripled their numbers.
At nightfall, under absolute darkness, they stood their ground against incessant waves of Japanese soldiers sent by General Kawaguchi. Against all odds, the American troops defending the ridge shifted the landscape of the entire war.
Before the day ended, the Japanese attacked Edson's 840 Marines, who had to fall back several hundred meters before the Japanese halted their night assault. It was a promising start for the Japanese, but it was only the first encounter in a battle that would stretch over several blood-soaked days. The following night, Kawaguchi and his more than 2,000 soldiers faced the entire Allied force in what became known as the Battle of Edson Ridge, named in honor of the leader who made the victory possible. In this second engagement, the American front had a small ace up its sleeve, a supply of light artillery, which provided excellent results in defending their position. Kawaguchi's 1st Battalion attacked the American right flank, but this time it was not as straightforward as in the initial combat. Although they managed to break through the Marine lines, the Japanese attack was halted by the units guarding the northern part of Point Lunga. Thus ended the first night of fighting.
In the evening on September 12th, as nightfall chased the American soldiers, Edson stepped atop a grenade box and addressed his troops, saying, quote, "You men have done a great job so far, but I have one more thing to ask of you. We have to hold out just one more night."
The next morning, September 13th, Edson ordered a counterattack. They did not manage to penetrate much territory, so the American troops fell back to regroup with the reserves and avoid diluting their capabilities. On the other hand, the Japanese made good use of the daylight hours to prepare for a second battle. This time, Kawaguchi would not separate his battalions or send soldiers through the jungle, which proved to be a subtle tactic. Instead, his men would advance directly towards the enemy, just as Edson had originally anticipated. The next attack began as soon as the sun went down. 2 companies from Kawaguchi's 2nd Battalion attacked from the south and pushed Edson's troops towards Hill 123 in the central part of the ridge. During the night, the Marines in this position, supported by artillery, withstood wave after wave of frontal assaults from the Japanese soldiers, many of which turned into hand-to-hand combat, reminiscent of the wildest scenes of World War I and its trenches. Japanese units that had infiltrated beyond the ridge and near the airfield were also repelled before they could seize control of important positions. Nevertheless, the situation was much more complex than during the initial attacks. Kawaguchi's troops seemed determined to annihilate the Americans.
The situation was increasingly showing in favor of Japan. The American soldiers were getting scared and falling back, till Edson came out of the command post with a couple of officers and strongly yelled at his soldiers to keep on fighting.
Brutal attacks by support battalions known as Kuma and Oka, positioned at other locations along the Lunga perimeter, were repelled by Edson's 840 soldiers. Gradually, a legend was beginning to form in the Pacific, a nearly Spartan tale in which a small force managed to defeat a powerful army, inflicting painful and unexpected casualties. September 13th would forever remain among the bloodiest pages of the Japanese army. Their performance was disastrous. Almost half of Kawaguchi's forces were annihilated by Edson's men, who took advantage of the terrain, their weaponry, and a series of ambushes to overcome the attackers. On that night, the Americans suffered only 60 casualties, which was minimal in proportion. However, the victory was not absolute and could have easily turned into a defeat due to an incredible error. Due to technical and human communication problems, some of Edson's soldiers thought they were retreating towards the north, heading for Henderson Field. This created an organizational crisis that had to be resolved by Major Kenneth Bailey. The man, who had suffered a severe head injury, took charge of regrouping the soldiers and updating the strategy initially devised by Edson. In this way, a second defensive wave was established, allowing the battle to continue for more than 10 hours into the morning of September 14th.
The tide began turning as heavy artillery fire was used by the Marines against their enemy. The Japanese who made it past these defenses were met by armed soldiers. If some brave or talented soldier managed to avoid the guns, they would be met by American fists. Several hand-to-hand battles were fought in the darkness. Each wave of Japanese soldiers was taken down.
Without Kenneth Bailey's incredible actions, the Japanese could have captured Point Lunga and also Henderson Field, which would have been a severe blow to the American presence in the Pacific. One can only imagine how this would have affected the campaign against the Axis in Asia. As we've mentioned, these victories in small territories proved crucial for the final outcome of the conflict, as they allowed the Allies to maintain a constant flow of resources to strangle the Japanese Empire. On September 14th, Kawaguchi led the survivors of his brigade on a 5-day march to the Matanikau Valley, where they joined Oka's unit. In total, Kawaguchi's forces lost 805 soldiers, while the Marines suffered 104 casualties. The difference was staggering and humiliating for the Imperial Island. On September 15th, General Harukichi Hyakutake learned of the defeat and sent the news to the Imperial General Headquarters in Japan. In an emergency session, high-ranking officials from the Navy and the Imperial Army came to a late but fundamental conclusion. Guadalcanal could lead to a decisive battle in the war. The results of the clash began to impact Japanese operations in other areas of the Pacific, as it became necessary to redirect supplies, personnel, and weaponry to sustain Japanese presence south of the Solomon Islands.
The Battle of Bloody Ridge marked a great victory for the Marines, who called the conflict the Battle of Edson's Ridge.
General Harukichi Hyakutake realized that he could not send enough troops and supplies to defeat the Allied forces stationed on Guadalcanal without pulling support from other fronts in Oceania. Therefore, with the approval of headquarters, he ordered the withdrawal of troops from New Guinea until the Guadalcanal situation was resolved. Additionally, he prepared to send more troops to the area defended by Edson's men in an attempt to retake the airfield. As the Japanese regrouped to the west, U.S. forces focused on bolstering and strengthening the Lunga defenses. On September 18th, an Allied naval convoy landed 4,157 soldiers of the 3rd Provisional Brigade and a battalion from the 11th Marine Regiment, along with 137 vehicles, tents, aircraft fuel, ammunition, food rations, and engineering equipment on Guadalcanal. The cavalry had arrived, and now the Japanese faced a much more formidable enemy. This would not have been possible without the initial resistance of the 840 soldiers led by Merritt Edson, which had severely diminished the enemy's presence in the area.
General Kawaguchi had lost 830 men during the battle. A still unclear number of wounded soldiers were also lost during the trip to Matanikau. The Marines calculated taking out around 500 Japanese soldiers, while losing 80 comrades between the 12th and 14th of September.
The Allied reinforcements allowed for a continuous defensive line to be established around the perimeter of Point Lunga by September 19th. However, Japan also had its small victories amidst the conflict. The American aircraft carrier USS Wasp was sunk by the submarine in 19 southeast of Guadalcanal while attempting to protect the convoy with reinforcements, temporarily leaving the USS Hornet as the only operational carrier in the South Pacific area. Washington also made some changes in the command of its units, transferring several underperforming officers off the island and promoting others to fill their positions. As weeks went by, Guadalcanal became an increasingly solid stronghold for the Americans. Japan redirected much of its effort to fighting in the region, but was unable to counter the arrival of new troops, weapons, and supplies. Gradually, the fall of the Axis seemed inevitable. After the campaign, General Edson became the Chief of Staff of the Fleet Marine Force in October 1944, with his work recognized by a Gold Star on his Legion of Merit. His various duties, whether in combat or rear echelon service, resulted in a continuous 44-month deployment in the war zone. When a young officer asked him when he expected to be rotated back to the United States, General Edson responded, "When the war is over and the work is done." For his extraordinary tactical ability and heroic actions far beyond the call of duty, Major General Merritt Austin Edson received a Medal of Honor citation, the highest decoration within U.S. service. To this day, his strategies are studied to understand how to overcome a numerically superior enemy by leveraging the terrain, weaponry, and the context of a conflict. And so, we reach the end of this epic video, where we analyzed one of the most remembered actions of the Marines in the Pacific. If you enjoy this type of content and want to learn about equally important events, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. Without further ado, we bid you farewell until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.